Hello, everyone, and welcome to my version of the Khan Academy site for the AP Government and Politics. So my goal for today, guys, is to get you guys through some of these slides so at least we can move on and attempt to have the test on the Friday we get back. So that's why I'm going to post this for you guys today on Tuesday, so at least you guys have some time to look over some of the PowerPoints and some extra information I'm going to give you guys. But understand that, like I said before, I want to try to get the test done by this Friday, so at least we can move on and get on to the next unit for the week after, because I know this is going to be a shortened week for you guys. So just make sure, if you're going to watch the video, make sure you pay attention, take some notes. It'll help you guys out tremendously. So I just want to get through a good portion of this PowerPoint so we can kind of finish up. All right. So when looking at kind of the last time we talked here, it was really about federalism and the separation between state and federal powers, obviously. And some laws actually create this change between the two. All right. So one of the first things is a full faith and credit clause. Now, this one kind of looks at how certain states have to recognize the different laws that are from another state, which is kind of creates a larger power for each state, that they kind of have to listen to someone else. So, for example, if there is a gun law, so a lot of times there are certain states that allow gun carry in their own vehicle and some others that don't. So the other state has to recognize that that is a law that is provided for certain states, and if you're a resident of that state, then you have to listen to that. Another one is extradition, and a lot of people know this usually a lot of times when it comes to crime, obviously, because if someone breaks a law, let's just say in Texas, and then they go to another state, and they're caught there, then they will send them back to the state with the worser crime and use that against them mainly. All right. So you guys did the forms already from the last class. Now, on the PowerPoint, I put up some advantages and disadvantages of federalism, so you guys can kind of get a good feeling about some of them. Now, one of the biggest problems is that certain things, because of states don't really have as much power as the federal government, which it's really based on your point of view whether it is a negative or a positive. That is clearly a thing that we're going to see later on the PowerPoint, what we like to call dual federalism or cooperative federalism. We see a major change in how the dynamic between state and federal powers is, and yeah, we'll talk more about this. So we already talked about McCulloch versus Maryland. We know what really happened. The impact of it was the strengthening of the federal government, right? The necessary and proper clause that was outlined, Article 1, Section 8, basically allows a federal institution to create other institutions that help them with their power. So just for example, the Congress needed money to spend in order to help with certain of their rule, of some of their powers, so they are allowed to create the federal bank, which is what protected it from being taxed. All right, so we start seeing more of this happening. Now, this is kind of like the beginning of working out the kinks of the government, but we see more of these situations occurring. So this is not necessarily a foundational Supreme Court case, but this one can be used to help. And if you had a question about McCulloch versus Maryland, a separation powers of federalism, you can use this Supreme Court case to kind of help you in that. Now, basically what happens here is that two men were kind of had a license for their own business that was on the Hudson River. Obviously, one of them was a federal, one was a state, and they kind of trying to figure out which one was more powerful, and they ruled that the federal license was more powerful because it's using the supremacy clause and the commerce clause, saying that the federal license was automatically stronger, so that person had gained their right to have their own business there instead of the other person because it was a federal license. So it only increased the size of the national government and what powers they had over individuals. Okay, I believe we talked about this the other day. Now, we start seeing more amendments passed that strengthen the federal government. So, obviously, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, each one of them it strengthened the individual's rights for sure, but it also showed that the supreme law was above everything else, right? Remember, this is the argument that I said that if a federal government had passed a law every state must follow that to the T. Right? There's no avoiding it, and when they do avoid it, bad things happen to that state or the person that is trying to stop or impede the law from being followed. So that's why I understand that these amendments only prove even further that the federal government's increasing in their ability to kind of govern the United States. All right, but then we look at dual federalism. Now, dual federalism was ideally what everyone believed it was going to be, where basically the federal government had their own area where they governed, and the state would have their own area where they governed. So basically, it would be a separate rule. Basically, that's really what dual federalism is. But the problem is that kind of changes over time, and we kind of always associate dual federalism with layer cake federalism. And you're kind of like, what does that mean? Well, if you in the next slide, we have basically a picture of a cake, and they always say, well, there's one part of the cake that's covered in one color, which that's the federal government's power, and then there's another layer that's covered in a different color, that's the state power. So it's almost saying there's one area that the federal government controls, they work on that stuff, and then the state works on the other side, and they're dual governing. That's basically what they're trying to say. All right, but that doesn't necessarily work as well as they think. All right, and if you want to need a visual representation, this is kind of like what I'm talking about. Dual federalism. It's a layer cake federalism where you see different parts of the cake is covered here, and they're ruled by one area, the other one's ruled by another. That's what what federalism was supposed to be when they had first created the 10th Amendment. They believed that it would be like this. Now, it does not necessarily stay like that for long. Now, dual becomes cooperative. Cooperative is a little different. Basically, what it's trying to say is that cooperative now changes to where they kind of work together. Now, there no longer is one area controls one thing and one area controls the other. It's basically the idea that for majority of the things in our society, they work together in most spaces. And it's kind of messed up because we understand that the federal government is always supreme. So even though we say they work together, a lot of times the federal government is in control anyway. So that's why a lot of people get kind of confused when you think about cooperative federalism. It's not like they're working on two separate entities. It's really the federal government's in control, but they're using the state's powers a lot of times to work intertwined with them. So this one usually they like to call marble cake federalism, and I'll tell you what that means in the next slide. But basically, it just shows you that dual federalism, it used to be that one section of the government rule one thing, and then it changed to being more they work together in a lot of things, or they're kind of mixed at this point. Now, we kind of look at this a lot of times when it comes to government funds, right? And we'll talk a lot about funding with federal government and state powers, because that's really the biggest thing that federal governments have leverage over the states. So kind of they kind of follow what the federal government wants based on the amount of money that the government will feed them. Now, when you look at this one, cooperative federalism, that's what it's called, marble cake federalism, because it's now if you looked at the previous photo, how it used to be kind of in layers, and now it's more mixed. They're mixed together. That's kind of like how you kind of think about dual versus cooperative federalism, how they're different, right? They both look delicious, but the reality is that it's different. They are completely different in the way that they work. And it used to be dual, but it changed to cooperative federalism. And it's very interesting concept of how it changed over time. Now, this happened because we saw that when there was a great crisis, right, it changed from dual to cooperative because when we allow the state to kind of have too much power on their own, then things might have some problems. Now, the biggest impact that had was the Great Depression, right? Where basically the states couldn't deal with the economic issues that were happening at the time. So the federal government basically had to almost take over completely and force them to do certain things, certain laws, certain mindsets that they had to kind of fix itself. Right, it turned to a national policy because they couldn't allow the states to go bankrupt, basically. So the national government basically took them all on and told them all to follow the same rule set that forced them all to be able to withstand the brunt of the Great Depression. And that's kind of how it changed. It originally used to be where the state used to have more control over its funding, what the banks could do, and all this stuff. But then that changed because of how horrible impact the Great Depression had on the United States. So the federal government basically had stepped in and taken care of it. So that's why it changed from being a separate but to being more mixed. So some of the things that you guys should think of. Now, what happens is over time, federalism changes even more. We start seeing even this concept called de-evolution, where basically it used to be the federal government had complete control, and it kind of goes back to the states in some aspect. Now, these are some questions I had posed for you guys, just in case you want to think to yourself: how has American federalism changed and developed? What factors have helped to drive this change? How did 19th century interpretations of American federalism deny some Americans their fundamental rights? How did the New Deal impact the relationship between national government and the states? Given the dynamic nature of federalism, what kinds of events might cause federalism to change in the future? Now, we just talked about a bunch of this stuff. So to yourselves, you can obviously answer these questions, and we can talk about this probably when we get back to class. So one of the biggest things that we start to see with new federalism is what they call it, where basically it's a concept of de-evolution, where the federal government now has impact to change policies of the states. So remember, sorry about that. Remember, the national government has power over the states in a lot of different ways, and the states do control what happens in their own state, obviously. But what happens is the federal government has a lot of influence over what they do, right? And there's a lot of different examples when it comes to this. Think about when it comes to certain laws, when it comes to certain products. So they talk about vaping, right? Vaping, I know recently this may not be the best example, but maybe cigarettes is probably a better example. Now, the federal government may want to push a certain tax on cigarettes. So what they do is they kind of give them a bargaining chip. They tell you, listen, we'll give you some grant money for your state that you need for certain things. Like if you need money for roads, we'll give you this much money in grants if you increase taxes on certain products like cigarettes, all right? And they use grants all the time. Now, there's different types of grants. Categorical grants, which are probably the most restrictive, is basically telling the states, we'll give you money for specific things. Like I just mentioned, here's a bunch of money, here's a categorical grant for roads. And if you follow what we say about cigarettes, then we'll give you this money, all right? And it basically causes them to almost barter for certain things. So the states will say, well, then, we need more money if we do this for you, right? It becomes almost like a shady back deal that a lot of people don't really know about, but they do this all the time. Now, fiscal federalism is this kind of concept where they're using money to barter for a cooperation between them. Like I said, it used to be dual, where they were separate, and went to cooperative, where basically they're mixed because of a major incident in the Great Depression. Then it allows the states to have more power with this new fiscal federalism, but then it's almost like it's in the back. It's very sneaky back dealing that kind of causes the federal government to still have more power than the states do. All right. Now, we'll look at some other things that kind of give states more powers here, but a lot of times with grants and aid, they have a lot of power here, all right? So that's why I say, it's a little bit of mixed, all right? Block grants, this block grant's a little different. Now, block grants basically allow the states to kind of pick what they want to do, all right? This is kind of like the greatest thing for states, and this is how the powers go back to the states in some way. They give them block grants, where basically it allows the states to kind of pick and choose what they want to do with the money that they get. And this is an extremely important step for states, all right? If they didn't have this, then basically they'd be restricted in every sort of way, but that obviously changes. All right, and we start to see this happen in a lot of different policies and different programs, where they give them a grant and they kind of pick and choose what they want to do with it, all right? Now, certain aspects are basically the idea of no child left behind. Basically, the federal government created certain aspects of even education. A lot of people say, well, how much power does national government have over education itself? And, this is kind of like one of those big, topics that we are, wondering even till today. So that was one of the ideas that happened, where they basically gave them a grant saying, we want you to push this education standardized testing for your students, and the states listen to them. And this is how it all started. That's why you guys take Regents exams. That's why we take all these different exams, is because of this occurring with grants. All right. So last question: under what circumstances should the national government transfer more authority to policymaking back back to the states and local governments.